going on, everyone? Welcome to the Ship My Money Show tournament edition for the main slate on Thursday, July 11th. Hopefully, you all had a good early slate. I didn't. Tends to happen when the most popular teams and pitchers all smash. It's really, really hard to win. Not that it's ever easy, but certainly makes it more difficult. But hopefully, it went well for you guys. The nice thing about split slates is if it didn't go well, you can just dive right back into a 7-gamer tonight. No weather issues to speak of, which is nice. Wind blowing out in Boston, which is also nice depending on if you plan on playing hitters there. So should be a pretty easy slate as far as dealing with that kind of stuff. Maybe some lineup issues because we do have a pretty spread out slate. Slate starts at 6:05 Eastern. If you weren't aware of that, that's why this show started earlier. But we have the Arizona-Atlanta game starting 3.5 hours after that, along with the Angels and Seattle. So maybe some late swapping needed for those lineups. Hopefully nothing too weird comes out there. But other than that, should be a relatively straightforward slate as far as that kind of stuff goes. If you're watching the show, give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel. All that stuff helps out quite a bit. If you haven't already checked out Endgame, which is my new site, along with Utical, Nerdy Tanner, and Brick75, there's a link in the description below to check that out. We're offering intermediate and higher level DFS strategy in the form of training videos, Discord access, monthly Q&A sessions, that kind of stuff. So we're still building that out, but we do have a bunch of videos up already. I'll talk about that some more in a little bit. But diving into the slate, starting with just a quick overview, because I didn't already do that today since we had the two slates. So just a quick overview touching on the pitching and hitting available pretty quickly before we get into how I appear to be playing the slate right now. Starting with the Dodgers taking on the Phillies in Philadelphia. Good hitters park here. Aaron Nola going for the Phillies, Landon Knack on the mound for the Dodgers. Knack not getting any ownership and not really warranted. Tough matchup with the Phillies, not a great strikeout pitcher or anything like that. Aaron Nola on the other side will get some ownership and probably should. Projected for about 23%. He's only 8,600 on DraftKings, so that is a pretty fair price tag when you consider the amount of talent that Nola has. It is obviously a very, very difficult matchup against the Dodgers, but it is also only a 7-game slate, so you just don't have as many pitching options as you normally would. There are some strikeouts on the Dodgers roster in their lineup as well. Dodgers rank 8th in strikeout percentage against right-handed pitching this season on their active roster. 111 WRC+. Obviously, this is a team that can do damage, but Mookie Betts being injured takes a low K guy out of the lineup. It obviously takes a really good hitter out of the lineup. So that combined with the salary for Nola looks okay. I'm not sure off the top of my head what I would be getting to. We can talk about that in a few minutes. But it makes sense, on the surface that he would come in somewhere in that 15 to 25% range. He's a talented pitcher. It's a shitty matchup. It's not a good park, but he has been better at home throughout essentially his entire career. So I think mostly he's just getting the ownership because he's 8,600. You need two pitchers. We had several of the day's best pitchers go earlier. Like if you go to Fangraphs and sort by strikeout percentage for today's probable pitchers, the top 4 pitchers were all on that 4-game early slate with Skeens, Flaherty, Gore, and Green. So the highest strikeout percentage this season of any pitcher going tonight is Luis Castillo at 24.3%. Nola comes in at 23.8, 3.35 xFIP. He's one of the most talented pitchers on tonight's slate. So the matchup isn't good, but I think the way that you can view that also when you consider the price tag is if he were facing most teams, he would be like 35, 40% at this price on this slate. So you are getting not only a salary discount, but some form of an ownership discount because of the matchup against the Dodgers as well. Offensively, both of these teams have relatively high implied run totals. The Dodgers, of course, just always have a high implied run total. So seeing an implied run total around 4.8 for them isn't saying a ton. The Phillies going up against Knack, pretty good spot, especially in this park. I hadn't actually looked, but we got a Phillies lineup, and Bryce Harper is in it. So that just makes this lineup a little bit more appealing to get to as well. Kyle Schwarber, Bryce Harper, both active. Trey Turner obviously gives you a lot of upside at shortstop. But getting those two lefties back against Knack is pretty nice. They are expensive, but it's clearly a very high upside lineup. So far, very limited sample for Knack, but he has allowed a 194 expected ISO to lefties. He has also struck them out 26% of the time. Again, a small sample there. Righties have struck out 18% of the time against him, 254 expected ISO. Going to the Cubs and the Orioles in Baltimore, it's actually not 100 degrees and humid here for the first time in, I think, a month. So the ball probably not going to carry quite as much as normal, but still a good park for left-handed power, not a good park for right-handed power. Justin Steele pitching for the Cubs, Albert Suarez for the Orioles. Suarez not getting much ownership, probably shouldn't. Not a great strikeout pitcher. Not a great matchup against the Cubs. Not a terrible one either. They do strike out. They have about a league average WRC plus. They're ranked 7th in strikeout percentage. If you need to pay down at pitcher and you want somebody low owned, Suarez is okay in large field stuff, but I don't anticipate him being a priority. Steele has a tough matchup here, but it's pretty similar to the Aaron Nola spot against the Dodgers. Steele's one of the best pitchers on the slate. He has a 24% K percentage, 3.53 xFIP. And that's, keep in mind, he struggled out of the gate this year when he came back from injury. So pretty clearly one of the most talented pitchers. Does have a tough matchup against the Orioles in Camden Yards. The Orioles' active roster since the start of last season, 22% K percentage against left-handed pitching, 118 WRC plus. A lot of their best hitters are left-handed, but they can also hit left-handed pitching. But it also turns Adley Rutschman around to the right side. It turns Anthony Santander around to the right side. So a pretty difficult spot for Steele. Getting about 20% ownership, very similar to Aaron Nola. Very reasonable 8K price tag. Offensively, prefer the Cubs side just because of the matchup against Suarez. Obviously just a better matchup going up against him than against Steele. But the Orioles do have more talent than the Cubs do. Suarez this year has allowed more power to right-handed hitters with a 190 expected ISO. That does work in his favor in this park. That's a big reason you see a 123 actual ISO allowed compared to that 190 expected ISO. This park does downplay right-handed power. We also don't have Cody Bellinger for the Cubs tonight. I don't think that their lineup has been released yet. At least it wasn't the last time that I updated stuff. But Cody Bellinger was placed on the 10-day injured list after getting hit on the hand in last night's game. So that does weaken the Cubs lineup a bit as well. For the Orioles, you do get negative correlation going up against Steele. He's getting 20% ownership. The Orioles are really good. So that does seem decent, even though it is a very difficult matchup against Steele. Tampa Bay taking on the Yankees in Tampa Bay. So pretty big park downgrade for the Yankees, but still obviously a very talented team. Shane Baz pitching for Tampa. Nestor Cortez for the Yankees. Cortez, another about 25% owned pitcher. He's fine. Like I said, there's not great pitching on this slate. 23.8% K percentage is one of the highest marks. 3.9 xFIP does get that park upgrade as well. Baz on the other side does have very good strikeout stuff. Hasn't had sustained success at the major league level yet, but was a highly regarded prospect. Does have good stuff. Wasn't working deep into games in the minor leagues typically, but was getting strikeouts. Really tough matchup against the Yankees. At 7,200, I think there is some merit to going to him if you need to pay down for pitching, since we don't have a ton of great top-end pitching on this slate, and he does give you strikeout upside. 9% ownership, if he comes in around 10%, I don't really have any issue with that. Offensively, I do have some interest in the Yankees just because they are the Yankees and they're facing an unproven pitcher in Baz, even though he is talented. You get Judge, you get Soto. Obviously, those guys are going to look really good. And then you get some cheaper bats throughout the lineup. It is a park downgrade for them, but Verdugo's cheap. Rice is cheap. If you're playing two of the more expensive pitchers, or maybe you want some more expensive one-offs, the Yankees can make some sense as a stack. Tampa Bay on the other side, not getting a ton of ownership, 5 to 10%, pretty much across the board. They are pretty cheap because some of their better players have struggled a bit. Tampa Bay overall just not having a very good season. 172 expected ISO allowed to righties for Cortez this season. Randy Arozarena, Yandy Diaz, no real problems there. You do have some pinch hit risk for Tampa Bay going up against the lefty. Ahmed Rosario certainly has pinch hit risk. Jose Caballero, Johnny DeLuca. These guys all could potentially get pinch hit for later in the game because every left-handed bat that the Rays have is on the bench with the exception of Brandon Lau. So, for example, you are probably going to get Josh Lowe hitting for Johnny DeLuca. As soon as you get a right-handed pitcher in the game, you probably get like Taylor Walls in for Caballero when a right-handed pitcher comes in, or for Rosario. So there are plenty of switch hitters that the Rays can go to. So that does kind of knock down the appeal of a full stack there. But guys like Diaz, Rosarena, Lau, lefty, certainly makes some sense. Clips is confused because I said Shane Baz is unproven. I think Shane Baz has probably made like a half season worth of starts in his entire career. So I don't know how he would be proven unless, Paul Skeens obviously proven, but Shane Baz has made a total of 10 major league starts. That is how he's unproven. 46 and a third innings pitched. Didn't pitch at all last season. Yeah. 4.08 ERA over those starts. That's pretty self-explanatory there. So yeah, he's phenomenally injury prone and was supposed to be their best starter, but hasn't been. He is talented, though, without a doubt. Going to the next one, Oakland and Boston. Tanner Houck in a very good spot for the Red Sox. Should be one of the most popular pitchers tonight, projected around 30%. He is a very good pitcher, very good strikeout matchup against Oakland. He has struck out 23.3% of hitters this year, 3.12 xFIP. The park is good for offense, and like I said, the wind is blowing out, so that doesn't work in Houck's favor. But Oakland overall this year, second highest strikeout percentage against right-handed pitching, 105 WRC plus. They do have some power, but they also don't have Shea Langoliers in the lineup. They don't have Tyler Soderstrom in the lineup. So a little bit weaker lineup than usual, especially with Langoliers not in there. Luis Medina on the other side, not getting any ownership, probably not really warranted. Big park downgrade, not a very good strikeout pitcher, facing a good Red Sox lineup. Offensively, if you're going to Oakland, it's simply because of the park upgrade and the ownership coming into Tanner Houck. For the Red Sox, they have one of the highest implied run totals on the board. I expect they'll be pretty popular. 14% projected ownership to Devers. Same range for O'Neill and Wong. David Hamilton pretty popular. Jarren Duran pretty popular. I think it's warranted for all of those guys. You do have some pinch hit risk for the lefties in this lineup, but it's not as much as when you get a left-handed starter against them and they go to like Ref Snyder. So there's some pinch hit risk for like Dom Smith or Yoshida or Abreu. It doesn't help that they are hitting back to back to back. You could very easily have Oakland just bring in a left-handed pitcher to face Yoshida, and one or two of those guys, if it's a relatively high leverage situation, are probably going to get pinch hit for. So it's a little bit of a downgrade to the Red Sox stack there, but overall they are in a good spot. Medina's not a terrible pitcher, but it's a good hitter's park. He doesn't miss a lot of bats. Looking at their bullpen, they do have all three of their lefties available, should be available. Scott Alexander, TJ McFarland, Kyle Muller. None of them have pitched back-to-back days, so I expect that they will be able to match up with those lefties in the Red Sox lineup. So there is some pinch hit risk there to keep in mind. Next, we have the Marlins and the Astros. Jake Bloss is going for Houston. He is not anything that I think we really need to worry about, and neither is Rodrigo Munoz going for the Marlins. Tough matchup for him. Obviously, it is a good matchup for Bloss. He'll probably get, I think I have him at like 5 to 10% owned. Yeah, I have him at like 9%, 6,200 for Bloss. I don't expect him to go too deep into this game. He does have a good strikeout matchup, good matchup overall, and he's cheap, but I don't expect him to go too deep into this game, so I don't think he's a particularly big priority. Rodrigo Munoz, tough strikeout matchup against Houston. I saw somebody say in chat, Power said in chat, that per the Astros beat writer, no Yordan Alvarez. So that does make the Astros stacks less appealing and also make the matchup for Munoz a little bit better, but not better enough that I want to get to him. Offensively, Miami, pretty tough to get to, although they are facing a pitcher in Bloss that has had no track record at the major league level. If I remember correctly, he got hurt like 3+ innings into his major league debut against the Orioles, and then I think this is his most recent start since then. So Clips might disagree with me, but I don't think he's proven at the major league level. Miami just sucks. I mean, Jazz Chisholm will be fine. There is some cheap power in Miami's lineup, but overall, they are pretty much never going to look like a huge priority. They do look better on today's slate than they normally do. Jake Berger has power. Chisholm, obviously, power and stolen base upside. De La Cruz has some power. So if you're going to a more expensive stack, maybe you're trying to get to like that Phillies stack, the Marlins can make some sense as a secondary one going up against Bloss. Houston, high implied run total. Again, the lineup is obviously weaker without Yordan Alvarez if he is in fact not in it, but that also makes them less expensive. And outside of Alvarez, they're really not expensive at all. Very favorable price tag on Bregman. Altuve is worth his price tag. Pena's cheap. Diaz is pretty cheap. Jake Myers is cheap and might get a lineup bump without Alvarez. So nice cheap stack here against a pitcher in Munoz that has certainly had his share of struggles as far as batted balls and hard contact goes this year. 254 expected ISO to righties, 271 to lefties. So the Astros do look pretty good in terms of just being one of the higher probability stacks today. I'm not reading all that clips. That's a lot of words that probably don't make sense. Seattle taking on the Angels in Anaheim or Los Angeles. Good hitters park. Really nice park upgrade for Seattle. Keep in mind, this is a team that plays in one of the most favorable hitters parks, or pitchers parks rather, in baseball. Very difficult to hit home runs, very difficult to score runs. And now they're going up against a pitcher who is making a jump from Double-A in Jack Kokonowitz. He wasn't striking a lot of guys out at AA. He is projected for around 13% ownership because he is 4K flat, but outside, and he obviously does have a good strikeout matchup against Seattle. This is a team with the highest strikeout percentage in baseball, but he's not somebody that was getting a lot of strikeouts at AA this season. He doesn't project to somebody, obviously, that's going to get a lot at the major league level because he wasn't getting them at AA. So if you're going there, it's because he is 4K flat, which is too cheap for a fully stretched out starter. At AA this year, 20.1% strikeout percentage in 16 innings pitched. Or 16 starts rather, 91 and a third, or 91 innings pitched. Last year, 16 starts at AA as well, 5 in high A, at AA in about 70 innings, 17.7% K percentage. Doesn't project as a high K guy, but the Mariners can turn anyone into a high K guy. And he is fully, like, he's a starting pitcher. This isn't somebody coming up and making a spot start and you're hoping they go 3 or 4 innings. If he's pitching well, he will continue to pitch. He went 9 innings in his most recent start at AA, so there's no workload concern. So just taking that, putting him at 4K, and then putting him against the Mariners is reason to consider him, and that's why he's getting about 13% ownership. Luis Castillo on the other side looks like one of the better pitching options tonight. 26% ownership, favorable matchup against the Angels. Now keep in mind it is a big park downgrade for him, and he does tend to struggle with power at times, has trouble locating his fastball, and can get hit pretty hard. 1.2 home runs per 9 overall this season, despite pitching his home games in a park where it's really tough to hit home runs. But the Angels are a pretty weak lineup overall. 22.7% K percentage, 89 WRC plus. So if you're going to the Angels, I think it's probably just because of the ownership to Castillo. Clearly you're picking on one of the more talented pitchers on the slate. For the Mariners, they do look good. Sean V mentioned ground ball numbers for Kokonowitz at AA. This season, 62.3% ground ball percentage. Last year, 48.6%. In high A in like 5 starts last year, it was about 63%. So he has been a good ground ball pitcher, like you said, especially this year. Seems like he's made some improvements. And that is something that you do want to see. If somebody's not missing bats at AA, they better be getting the ball on the ground, because if they're giving up fly balls and not missing bats, that's really, really bad. But that can also go like 2 ways here. If he's on and locating well, then yeah, he's likely to get a lot of ground balls. But you're talking about a Seattle team that does have power in their lineup. They just struggle to make contact, and they're facing a guy that doesn't miss a lot of bats. So in spots like this, where you have hitters that are selling out for home runs and have a lot of swing and miss, I generally don't mind taking some chances against a ground ball pitcher that will allow them to hit the ball. If he is, locating really well, it's not going to go well. But the margin for error on pitchers like that is generally really small. And then you are talking about a guy that hasn't pitched above the AA level. So, again, you can play him at 4K, but I am interested in Seattle here as well, especially because of the park upgrade they're getting. And then finally, you have Atlanta taking on the Diamondbacks in Arizona. We have Brendan Pfaadt going for Arizona, Max Fried for Atlanta. Fried getting about 14% ownership at 8,800. Tough strikeout matchup against the Diamondbacks. Tough matchup overall. But he is a very good pitcher. We know he can work deep into games and just sort of accumulate strikeouts as a result of that, even though he only has a 21% K percentage for the year. 3.44 xFIP. I do think it's interesting that he's only getting 14% ownership. He's not somebody that I generally get to a lot, since I do prioritize strikeouts so much. But on this slate, just talking through it, where you have, 20 to 25% ownership coming into Nola against the Dodgers, you have 20 to 25% coming into Castillo with a park downgrade. You have 20 to 25% coming into Nestor Cortez. Max Fried is just as good an actual pitcher as any of those guys. The strikeout stuff isn't as good, but it is kind of interesting to me that he's getting less ownership. Probably warranted, given that he doesn't have a great strikeout matchup either. But it is a spot at the very least that I think if you are taking on some more popular bats and you don't want one of those 20 to 25% owned guys, Fried would make some sense as a pivot. Brandon Pfaadt at 7,300 seems pretty interesting to me. 23% ownership. Not a great matchup against Atlanta, but again, missing Harris, missing Acuna. The lineup's just not as deep as it normally would be. So he still has his work cut out for him dealing with those guys at the top, with Olsen and Riley and Albies and all of those guys. But when you take Harris out, you take Acuna out, obviously you're just not replacing them with anybody nearly as good as those guys are. So it does it does make the matchup a little bit better, just less really good hitters that he has to face. And then on top of that, he is pretty cheap on a slate that doesn't have really good pitching. He's done a good job limiting power to both sides of the plate this year. 137 expected ISO to lefties, 150 to righties. Strikeout percentage against righties has been about 10 points higher than against lefties. At this price, though, I just think he looks pretty good overall. 22.4% strikeout percentage, 3.8 xFIP. Those numbers aren't all that different from the more expensive pitchers that are getting similar ownership in just as bad, if not worse, matchups. Offensively, obviously, you can always go to the Braves, but again, Fod has done a good job limiting power this year. Arizona, I think, is pretty difficult to get to as well. Fried's not getting a lot of ownership, so it doesn't work as well. Like if you're looking to negatively correlate, you're probably going to look to like Oakland or the Angels or the Dodgers even before the Diamondbacks, since Fried's not getting as much ownership as those guys, and he is a very difficult pitcher to hit against. So pretty tough, I think, to make a case for Arizona. Hopefully, when I flip over to my current exposures, it's not just Arizona everywhere, because that would be hard to explain. But now I'm going to go ahead and take a look at that. Keep in mind, I did run this stuff before a few lineups came out. We didn't have the Oakland lineup yet. We didn't have the Yankees lineup yet. So you will see some guys showing up that are grayed out, I think. Yeah. So like Shea Langoliers was in when I ran these lineups, but yeah, nothing I can really do about that. So just starting with the pitching that I'm getting to, Brandon Pfaadt, you can see here at the top, showed up 36% of the time. It's just a good value play. He's a pretty good strikeout pitcher. His strikeout stuff is pretty much on par with anybody else pitching today. The matchup's not great, but none of the good pitchers today have great matchups. Castillo has the best matchup, or I guess Hal has a really good matchup. Castillo has a good matchup, but they're both in hitter-friendly parks. So there's no pitcher with a perfect, this is a great matchup and in a pitcher-friendly park. And Houck's a lot more expensive. So getting the FOD here, getting the salary relief just makes sense to me. Aaron Nola, again, really scary spot against the Dodgers. I'm not pretending that Aaron Nola doesn't carry risk here, but all of the pitchers do. He's a little bit less expensive than usual. The bottom of this order is not particularly good. There are strikeouts with Outman, Taylor, Gavin Lux. Gavin Lux being in the lineup, by himself just makes me like the opposing pitcher. I'm sure that talks him into a home run here, but you can say you don't like Aaron Nola. That's fine. Just play more Justin Steele, play more Nestor Cortez. They're very, very similar plays. And you can see in my exposures here that Nola, Cortez, Steele, Castillo, Houck, all 22 to 32%. They look very similar to me. Houck is clearly the best of the group, but he's also the most expensive. So I'm not really surprised that they're all just kind of showing up in that range. That's perfectly fine. I'm a little surprised that Fried's only showing up 4%. But it makes sense when you consider that I'm basically just over the field on all of FOD, Nola, around the field on Cortez, Steele, Houck, Castillo. I think Fried does look a little bit worse than those guys. And like I was saying before, in tournament lineups, where I would want to get to him is if I am choosing to get away from one of these guys. But it seems like my offenses are probably low enough owned that I was just able to play the pitchers that look a little bit better. And like I said, I generally just don't get to a lot of Max Fried. That's not something that I usually end up being right about. So keep that in mind too, that's just typically how it works out for me. The one kind of surprising thing, Albert Suarez did show up 16% at 6,900. So I think it kind of seems like I'm playing Suarez like the field is playing Kokonowitz, which I don't mind as long as I'm not sacrificing too much in the way of hitters. So I want to look at Albert Suarez lineups because if I'm playing pretty, high upside lineups with him, I do like that. Like looking at this one, we're getting a 5-man Red Sox stack. It has Devers, it has O'Neill, it has Duran. So it has the main pieces that I would want there. We have some cheap one-offs, but Ben Rice batting cleanup, Austin Wells batting sixth. Those guys are fine. Lawrence Butler batting cleanup. It's not like there's anything wrong with those guys. Obviously, they could be better if I went down to Kokonowitz, but they're not 9-hole hitters that are really, really bad or anything like that. Here we have a 5-man Dodgers stack with the Phillies. That obviously is a very high upside lineup just on its surface. It has Ohtani, it has Schwarber. It does have these bottom of the order guys with Outman, Taylor, and Lux. So like if you went down to Kokonowitz, maybe you can upgrade that a little bit, but it has Turner, it has Schwarber, it has Ohtani. So I don't mind it. I think where you have the field going to Shane Baz a little bit against the Yankees, you have the field going to a double-A pitcher that doesn't get strikeouts. That is pretty popular. I don't mind using Suarez as a low-owned pivot. I do think that if ownership ends up between now and lock, like restart, when I rerun everything, if Suarez's ownership were like 10, 11% instead of 4 or 5, then I think he falls back for me and I do just get more Boz or more Kokonowitz. But with that 5% projected ownership, I do like that at less ownership than Boz and Kokonowitz. So that one's interesting, stands out. And again, that is a Cubs lineup that we do not have yet, but will not have Cody Bellinger. So you're losing your best hitter essentially. Looking at stacks, this is where it does not get a lot of fun. It's not a lot of fun for me, but Oakland showing up at the top. This has nothing to do with Tanner Houck. He is really, really good. I don't want to take hitters against him. When you're just talking about him, the pitcher, he doesn't allow power. He gets strikeouts. All of that is true. 127 expected ISO against lefties, 150 against righties. But when I ran this, Langoliers was in. So the drop from him to Kyle McCann could downgrade Oakland for me a little bit. But also, they're just projected across the board for like 3 to 5% ownership on a 7-game slate going against a 30% owned pitcher. So it's a situation where it's not going to go well all that often, but when it does, it is likely to pay you very nicely. So they're showing up for that reason. And then also something to keep in mind here that I think just kind of generally goes overlooked is, this is a bad spot for Oakland, but they still have a higher implied run total than they typically do as a result of playing in Fenway Park. Their salaries are a result of what they've done all season long. So they're essentially priced to play, a lot of their games in Oakland. They're playing in Fenway with the wind blowing out. So even though the matchup against Houck isn't good, they're still more likely to succeed today than they are in most games. And it's not like their prices came up. So they offer value. They offer negative correlation. They're very, very low owned in terms of their own raw ownership. Low probability stack, but when it goes well, it is likely to pay you off really well, as opposed to, just playing the teams that look really good. And then when it goes well, you still lose 40% of your money because everybody else played them too. So I'm not, it's sort of like Kyle Freeland yesterday, where I'm not expecting it to go well. I'm not predicting it does, but it does grade out as one of these spots that is likely to pay you the most money when it does work out. Seattle, sort of similar there. They're going up against a relatively popular pitcher. We have a AA pitcher getting double-digit ownership because of his salary. It's not because he's any good. I don't mean that in that he's bad. Like we already talked about him. He gets a lot of ground balls, doesn't get strikeouts. But the reason he's getting ownership isn't because he was just like lights out at AA, striking everybody out and unhittable or anything like that. He's getting ownership because he is $4,000. If he were 6,500, like a normal starting pitcher, he would probably be like 5% owned today. So whenever you get an SP2 like that on DraftKings, they become pretty appealing to stack against anyway. And then here you have a nice park upgrade for Seattle. Talked about all of this when I went game by game at the top, but nice park upgrade for Seattle, a team that has a lot of swing and miss, but also a lot of power against a pitcher that's going to have a small margin for error command-wise and is going to let you put the ball in play. That sets up pretty nicely for Seattle. Atlanta, pretty interesting here because I do have so much Brandon Pfaadt, but also not really that surprising. In non-Brandon Pfaadt lineups, Atlanta isn't likely to be that popular. Brandon Pfaadt is getting ownership, so you're getting negative correlation there. You have a lot of talent on Atlanta. It's not a spot that I mind being on both sides across a set of lineups. I think it's likely if I were playing like 1 or 3 lineups or something, I probably would be getting Pfaadt before I got to Atlanta as far as prioritization goes. But, across a bigger set, and even in 3 lineups, I don't think there'll be anything wrong with like 1 Atlanta stack and then 1 or 2 Pfaadt teams. But across a bigger set of lineups, this is a spot that I don't mind being on both sides. Philadelphia, just one of the better spots on the slate going up against Knack in Philly. He's one of the weaker pitchers. Not that he's terrible, but one of the weaker pitchers. Good Philadelphia lineup with Harper and Schwarber back. That one doesn't have a whole lot of game theory or anything to it. Knack's not getting any ownership. It's just that they are one of the more likely teams to succeed. They are not showing up for me as 5-man stacks, which again probably has something to do with the fact that they're expensive and Knack's not getting much ownership. But they do look like a team that I'm using a lot in 2 and 3-mans, particularly 2-mans. So probably pretty likely that like I'm playing the A's and then Harper Schwarber or something like that. Here you can see cheap Seattle bats and then Turner Schwarber. Random mix of stuff there. Angels, Phillies, Seattle looks like a 3-3-2. Dodgers, couple Phillies, more Dodgers and Phillies, Seattle and Phillies. So not Oakland specifically, but those are the types of lineups that I'm getting, where I'm getting a couple of those good Phillies bats, not necessarily getting to all of them. So they are showing up as far as all stacks go, but not a lot as far as five mans. The Yankees going up against Boz. Park downgrade. They are cheap though. We talked about this. When I went game by game, it's a talented pitcher in Boz. It's also a talented lineup in the Yankees. Getting to Judge, getting to Soto, clearly is going to look pretty good. First one I look at here has a five man, doesn't have Judge, does have Soto, so it's using this value. It's paired with the Cubs, and then I'm getting two of the better pitchers in Cortez and Houck. So they look fine. Anytime you can get the Judge and Soto, it looks good. You have a cleanup hitter at 3,800 in Rice. If I look at the five mans, Oakland getting a lot of them. Again, it's not likely to work out, but it should pay off when it does. One thing that I did look at too is while that's a lot of Oakland stacks, they are very spread out as far as who they're paired with. So 5-3 with Baltimore, 5-3 with Philly, 5-3 with the Yankees, one each, 5-2 with Atlanta, Dodgers, Red Sox, Houston. So you can see getting to teams that are really good and likely to succeed. Like these are obviously just all the highest upside offenses on the slate. You don't see like Oakland plus Miami or anything like that for me. So that's good. And then also I like that they are spread out when you're considering, across a whole set of lineups. If I do happen to get the game where Oakland does well, I don't then just want all of that Oakland money tied up in like, oh, well, now I also need the Braves to do well, or I need the Red Sox to do well, or whatever. If Oakland does well, I want to be very diverse across who I have paired Oakland with to try and maximize the chances of me grabbing one of the top spots in the tournament. So that is something that I think is interesting to note when you see so many more five-man stacks going to one team than any other. Other than that, I am pretty spread out on five mans. The Cubs was a team that I'm not getting a lot of overall, but I am getting to them as five mans. Obviously, weaker lineup than usual without Bellinger, but the Orioles bullpen is banged up. They are missing Danny Coulomb. They have had to work a lot in general recently because they had one day off in all of June. So, I think it's a high upside stack spot. There's not a lot of guys from the Cubs that I love as far as like one-offs or two-mans because they don't have a lot of really good hitters. But you have a pitcher in Suarez that isn't anything special. You have a bullpen behind him that can get in trouble quickly. So it's a situation where like there's a lot of one-offs I like more than individual guys on the Cubs. But if things go south for Suarez, obviously the Cubs, you just want as many Cubs as you can get. So there is add-on upside against this Orioles team if you can get into the weaker part of the bullpen. So that makes sense to me. Miami showing up a little bit as a five-man. Mentioned, going up against Bloss. That's another spot where like generally I'm going to prefer a five-man over one-offs. Like if I have a Chisholm one-off or Burger one-off or mini stack, that stuff's fine. But it's kind of a similar situation there where if I have a primary stack and I'm just looking for a one-off or a two-man, I'm going to be able to find higher upside home run guys than anybody playing for the Marlins. But if this guy making his second major league start just shits the bed, then Miami is a cheap team that is then in a really good spot. So I do like that where I am getting to Miami, it is generally a lot of Miami together, stacked together. Looking at individual players, individual hitters, pretty happy with the guys that are showing up the most. The exception is Max Schumann. Don't love getting a 9-hitter in 20% of my lineups. I think the reason he's there is one, because I'm getting to Oakland. Two, shortstop, just not the best position today. Like you look at some of the names, CJ Abrams played earlier. Ellie De La Cruz didn't play, but the Reds played earlier. When you look at the projections that I have for shortstops, Trey Turner obviously projects well, but he's 6K. Gunnar Henderson obviously projects well, but he's 6,300. David Hamilton is fine, but like he's pretty expensive. JP Crawford's nothing to write home about. Jeremy Pena is fine, but it's not like he's one of these top 10 shortstops. So I do think punting shortstop from a roster construction standpoint is not the worst idea in the world. Again, Schumann's not the guy that I'm super excited about having. I certainly wouldn't be upset if when I rerun everything, he drops off a little bit. But for one, he is in a lot of my Oakland stacks, which is fine. And then two, if you are just kind of punting, that's okay as well. But mostly I think it's that he's in Oakland stacks also. But outside of that, Brett Harris, same kind of thing. 2,500 at third base. I think he's in a lot of my Oakland stacks. So I don't mind it as much. He's not somebody I would really want as a one-off all that often. So I have Harris shows up in 67% of my Oakland stacks. So 10 out of 10, he's in 10 Oakland stacks. Schumann's in 10 Oakland stacks. Overall, they were in 10. So every lineup that Schumann and Harris are in are stacks, Oakland stacks. So that's fine with me. I wouldn't really want them as one-offs because they're not particularly high upside guys. So Oakland's just showing up a lot. Again, that lineup came out and is a little bit different. Shea Langoliers isn't in there. Cal Raleigh, we don't have a Seattle lineup yet, but I do like him a lot as a catcher. I always do, but he's getting the park upgrade here. He has a lot of power. He has as much power as pretty much any catcher in baseball. And then you also, I might even get more of him now because we don't have Langoliers on the slate. But 4,500 is a very reasonable price tag for the power he has. He's really only that cheap because he plays his home games in Seattle and it pulls his numbers down. He would be more expensive than 4,500 if he played every game against a pitcher with like a 14% strikeout percentage in Angel Stadium. So I do like getting the Cal Raleigh quite a bit. I'm glad that's showing up. I like Shohei Ohtani. He's getting ownership, but he obviously Shohei Ohtani, so liking him isn't really going out on a limb. But in addition to him being Shohei Ohtani, he is negatively correlating with Aaron Nola. So in the lineups where I don't have an $8,600 pretty cheap Aaron Nola, it does make sense to be getting to at least a little bit of Dodgers against him. And Ohtani obviously is the guy most likely to do damage because he is the best hitter on the team. Langoliers, we already talked about. Polanco, cheap in Angel Stadium, gets the park upgrade. Kyle Schwarber, Trey Turner, Rodriguez, certainly like all of those guys. As far as where I'm getting the most over the field, it is Oakland across the board. Again, if this even comes up to 10% or something, I'm probably not going to get as much, but they're not getting any ownership right now. They are facing a really popular pitcher, so they're showing up for me. This is the type of team that could, as a whole, be a little bit more popular than expected because they are showing up as a good team in Sims, and a large percentage of the field is using some version of Sims. So, maybe you do get 7% ownership instead of 3 to 4. But outside of Oakland guys, Zach Neto against Castillo. Again, shortstop's just not that good of a position today. I don't mind getting some negative correlation in a good hitter's park. I was getting over on Langoliers. That might just turn into Kyle McCann. I'm not sure. Over on Cal Raleigh, over on Matt Olson against Brandon Fod. So negative correlation for him in my non-Brandon Fod lineups. So don't mind that. As far as guys that I'm not getting to the Red Sox a lot, which they're in a good spot. But they are getting quite a bit of ownership. I am a little bit concerned, like I said, about that group of lefties, Yoshida, Abreu, and Smith, because they are all bunched together. Oakland does have 3 left-handed relievers they can go to. At best, you're probably getting lefty-lefty matchups for these guys later in the game. And at worst, you're getting Rob Refsnyder hitting or one of the other right-handed guys hitting. So there is some risk there, and they are getting some ownership. Not getting the Castellanos, that's a function of not getting any 5-man Philly stacks. Obviously, he slots in behind Kyle Schwarber, Trey Turner, and Bryce Harper as far as guys that I'm trying to prioritize from the Phillies. Not getting to as much of Boston, Connor Wong, David Hamilton. These guys are showing up as players I'm not getting to. Randall Grichuk, another pinch hit guy. You have a lefty starting for Atlanta in Fried. Grichuk is probably out of the game as soon as Fried is out of the game, and it's not like matchups against Max Fried are particularly appealing. Not getting the Hayes. He's another pinch hit risk guy. They have left him in some recently because he is a very good defensive player as well. But if this is a competitive game, it is pretty likely when Steele comes out of the game that he is getting pinch hit for. You have Cedric Mullins starting, but Heston Kjerstad is not. So potentially Kjerstad pinch hits for Hayes. Probably depends on the score, though, because that is a defensive downgrade by a lot. So some pinch hit risk for Hayes, not a ton, but not really upset about these guys I'm not getting to. Obviously, not getting to Boston is really risky, but I am pretty happy with the offenses I'm getting to overall. Saying I'm happy with Oakland, I guess, is kind of exaggerating, but I understand why it's happening. So that's pretty much everything I have here. I'll scroll back through, and I think I missed a couple of questions. TTID Forever said, in the Philly stack, for instance, with my customary 8 lineups, how do you decide to stack in that stack, seeing that they have expensive bats? For me, everything I'm doing is automated. Like, I'm not making conscious choices, but I would be obviously looking to get what I can of Harper, Schwarber, Turner, and then whatever fits around them. Like Harper, Schwarber, Turner, I think are the priorities. And then you're just, the next tier is Stott, Bohm, Castellanos. Basically, in their case, working your way down the lineup. Bohm, Stott, Castellanos, and then it's another drop to Marsh, and then it's another drop to Rojas and Stubbs. Like, I ideally wouldn't want Rojas and Stubbs if I'm playing like 8 lineups. They're guys that maybe show up if you're playing a lot more than that, but ideally you just don't even need them at all. Clip's actually saying something positive. Appreciate that. Orioles against Steele. Yeah, I mean, I'm not really getting a lot of them, as you saw. They are a really good offense, and you're not wrong for playing them. I'm not there. Is Oakland projected to be the highest owned stack tonight? That would be really bad for me. I think there's a chance they end up being higher owned than they're projected for, but if they're the highest owned stack, there's a really big edge in DFS because they shouldn't be. They look like the stack that I'm going to have the most of, but that's because they are not going to be anywhere close to the highest owned stack. Yeah, so that's everything I have. Kid Kobe said Nola or Castillo. I have a little bit more Nola, but they're basically the same play. Better matchup for Castillo. Yeah, they're similar. Like, I guess if you're just like, you have a spot in your lineup where you're just plugging one of them in, I would lean Castillo. I assume I have him projected better, but I'll double check. Yeah, I have Castillo by like a point, so for all intents and purposes, it's like the same play. He's a little bit more expensive, but if it's not costing you anything, just Castillo's spot is better. So that's all I have for you. Thanks again for checking out the show. Don't forget to check out Endgame Syndicate. Link is in the description below. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, all that stuff. I'll be back tomorrow, 11 a.m. for the early show, and then I assume 5 p.m. for this show. Thanks again for checking it out.